And we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. As I get everything queued up here, and we'll get our co-host, Adam Myers, joining us momentarily. I welcome you to this month's edition of Naturism, Philosophy, and Life. And we're going to conclude, for the moment, our series on Frank Herbert's Dune and Tolkien's Hobbit books. And today, kind of a climax. I'm sure Adam and I will revisit this. Uh, Maybe by then, when we hit this segment once again, I'll know how to hit all the toggles properly. But in any case, we'll conclude this stretch of our series looking at Herbert and Tolkien, in a sense, head to head, looking and comparing and contrasting the men as authors, as well as the two books we've been looking at. Once again, Tolkien's Hobbit and Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, before we catch up with Adam and see what we're doing, just a reminder, this series uses naturism as a fulcrum, as a lens through which to view different topics. And this is the third of this mini series. And we haven't talked that much about nudism whatsoever. And that actually is for a certain reason. And that is Adam and I are of the same opinion that something of the dead end of the nudist movement has to do with the fact of it only being and naturists only talking about being naked, which strikes most people as rather myopic, if not altogether strange. And so part of the broadening of naturism, which originally was a much broader movement altogether, has to do with, there are very important topics that people who enjoy naturism can talk about that don't always have to obsess about being naked. So that's why we've kind of gone off on this very delightful study of literature. And just one announcement before we indeed catch up with Adam, and that is to take a look at our Litchfield County Naturist page on our college site. Here we have philosophy in our skin. We have all sorts of things. But speaking about philosophy, including an earlier edition of this series, philosophy, not to diverge into pedagogy, which is educational philosophy, but I think a lot of the dead end that schools have found themselves in, very quickly coming to the end of that dead end with, here's our beautiful newsletter, with the rise of AI and the total utilitarian triumph of education, which is upon us. Part of the reason for that dead end within pedagogy and Western education has to do, I believe, with an error, and that is separating knowledge from incarnated reality. And so, while I encourage you to check out our website and perhaps join us here in Connecticut or New York for one of our events, we just had our Labor Day event. You also might be asking, what the hell does a nudist group have to do with the school? Well, like I say, one of the errors of modern education has been to focus solely on knowledge acquisition, and now we have robots that can do that better, and we are losing um, that grasp with reality. And I think it remains for the schools that will survive the next few decades to really recover that idea of incarnated knowledge. And perhaps at some other point in this series, we can revisit that. But I have jabbered on for far too long, and Adam has been far too generous with my jabbering. So welcome, Adam. How are you doing? And what's up with yourself?
Oh, not much. I'm hanging in there. How about yourself?
Good, good. And for the audience's sake, I want everyone to know that Adam and I have been drug tested for spiced melange, and we're guilty as charged. We have failed our Dune drug test. We're hopped up on spiced melange. You can check our last episode for that. But I'm very much looking forward to getting into this series, or to concluding this series and to getting into this episode myself, Adam. And so, I have a few quotes lined up and um, a few things of that nature. But perhaps just briefly, you can maybe recap the first two episodes we did, and just briefly lay out The Hobbit and Dune. Just world building, light stuff with characters, perhaps whatever you think is appropriate to bring our audience up to speed.
Okay, I can take a stab at it, although my memory's not so great. It's a couple months ago we started.
Indeed, and it's about 10
Um,
o'clock at night here on the East Coast, so there's always
fair,
that.
fair. So, well, I mean, I'll start with the hero's journey. You had a nice picture for that, so I'll guess let's start from that. From my understanding, The Hobbit was a traditional hero's journey in full. I mean, Tolkien did some reworking here and there, but it's basically a hero's journey. I mean, it's very, very mythopoetic. Whereas Dune is an inverted hero's journey.
Mm.
It's very much critiquing the hero's journey. So that to me is a major distinction between the two. A lot of what happens to Paul is almost a mockery of the hero's journey. Almost. It's a lot more. It's the hero's journey deliberately taken as a spectacle
Mm.
rather than something real.
That's very interesting. And on a lighter note, that almost reminds me of um, you have in pop culture, you have your Disney films, which are, well, I don't know, whoever Disney has hired the past century obviously knows what they're doing. What my personal opinion of the Disney Corporation aside, they obviously have found a formula that works, like Spice Melange, let's say. Um, and the parallel that you bring up here, I think, is the Shrek franchise. The Shrek franchise, if people aren't familiar, is actually a deliberate mockery of the princess stuff in general, especially the Disney princess tropes. And it's interesting that you bring this up with The Hobbit and Dune, because I noticed something between Tolkien here, pictured later in life, and Frank Herbert. And I think that's very appropriate in terms of a literary analysis between uh, an archetypical, a deliberate hero's journey, um, and an anti-hero's journey that we'll see between The Hobbit and Dune. So we'll revisit that, but thank you for bringing that aspect up. How would you describe the worlds of The Hobbit and Dune? And that might actually illustrate the point you just made, in fact.
Well, again, I think that Frank, sorry, that Herbert and Tolkien were both were both men of their time, and they weave their own philosophy into their writing. Not necessarily directly. Again, Tolkien, for example, hated allegory, whereas Herbert loved it. They very, very distinct in how they were writing their stories. But in terms of the world building, um, Dune, I think, is a very, very bluntly modernistic
Mm,
story. It's very critical of fantasy. It's very critical of enchantment as a rule, right? Whereas Tolkien is deliberately trying to enchant the modern world, to re-enchant, to bring the mythopoetic into the modern for the modern man to read and experience once again, right? In a certain sense, you can think of Tolkien being somebody who's looking backwards and trying to help people remember the past, whereas Herbert is telling people that they need to let go of the past.
mm.
They need to let go of what came before and embrace the now. So I think that what the messages they're trying to send are completely opposite to each other. Now, my understanding of Herbert is that he's still, he's not saying that like the entire past should be completely ignored, that there's no wisdom in the past. He's not quite saying that. He's just simply reframing the direction that the readership is looking at.
And in terms of that world building, with the Hobbit, where's my Hobbit image? Oh, okay, I just have the cover here. This does not do the Hobbit justice altogether in terms of the bucolic and sylvan environment. But as we spoke about in our first episode, Tolkien partially wrote The Hobbit and wrote The Lord of the Rings to, in a sense, preserve in text the English countryside, which was being the English countryside and something of the English character, which was being lost in his day and age, not just because of industrialization, but also something that I think is very pressing on 20th century literature in both of these examples. Also, the influence of war and the disruption of war. And of course, war and the war imagery finds itself in that inspiration. Tolkien was in the First World War. He'd fought, believe it or not, at the Battle of the Somme, January 1st, 1916, which Americans don't really know anything about, but Englishmen do. It was a horrible contest. I don't know. There really isn't a World War I analog for Americans. It would be something like D-Day, I suppose, for Englishmen, the Battle of the Somme, or Gallipoli for Australians. But in any case, Tolkien has that background, and that also finds its way, as I say, into some of the battles in Lord of the Rings proper. Some of that epic aspect. And then I did check this out before we began broadcasting. There's a little bit more of the bucolic atmosphere of Tolkien. And then when we come to Frank Herbert, he was in the Second World War, relatively briefly, in 1942 for about 6 months before an injury drummed him out. He was in the Seabees. How would you describe the Seabees? They're like merchant marines. Is that fair, Adam?
The Seabees?
The Seabees,
Oh
yeah.
no.
I'm pretty sure they're like merchant marine. There was West Coast like merchant marines, if I'm not mistaken.
We're talking about the same people, no.
Yeah.
Seabees is construction.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Engineering.
Okay, all right. And Adam's the man to know because you did what, 8 years? 8 years in the Marines?
4.5. I did 4.5.
Okay, yes. So yeah, are they still? Is that when I hear Seabees, I just think World War II, but obviously it's still a nickname for an existing group.
Yeah. Seabees are naval construction.
Okay, all right. So at least I got the naval part right, but my okay. Thank you for that correction. So in any case, so both men have influence, or they have that background in the war, and it's interesting. I think, because I've written about this before, the difference between World War I and even post-World War I literature, which is very earnest, and then World War II literature, which is most sarcastic. If you compare the poetry of the First World War, yeah, I mean, some of it can be pretty rough, by 1916, 1917, 1918. But there's still a restraint to it. But if you compare something like even All Quiet on the Western Front, which was written in 1927, 10 years after the war, and compare that to something like Catch-22, that would be a good example of post-war literature. Even All Quiet, which is dark enough, a German example, there's still a restraint to it and a traditional formality compared to a Catch-22 or The Naked and the Dead, or certainly Slaughterhouse-Five, where there's a certain vulgarity to it, a certain realness, perhaps, a certain graphic goriness. And I think, getting back to our purpose here this evening, you can see that shift between The Hobbit and Dune, right? I mean, in terms of a snapshot of 20th century literature, there's a certain magical aspect, enchanted aspect here, British, European, compared to Hobbit, to Dune, American, later 20th century, grittier, certainly. I don't think you have anything quite as nasty as the sandworms. What do they call the sandworms in Dune? I have a blockage on that. Um, we'll call them graboids for tonight, but that's not their name. But there is, there is something a little bit rougher about Dune compared to The Hobbit, and they're not just two stories. Where I like to hit literature from is almost as artifacts between early to mid 20th century compared to mid to late-ish 20th century. You see that not just in these two examples, but I could give you, half a dozen on either side there, and you would see the point that was being made. So just some thoughts there that I had.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, everything seems pretty on point to me. Uh, Again, some of this is out of my depth, but it does seem correct from what I'm able to understand.
And then we can also chew over religious influence between Tolkien, British, Catholic, of a certain generation, maybe the last generation, where there were really, really defined class roles in Britain. Something that his contemporary Evelyn Waugh, another Catholic British writer, actually wrote quite a bit about at the same time. But they were breaking down. They were certainly breaking down. Tolkien dies, I believe, in 1973. So they had, those distinctions had come from another generation by that point, but not when Tolkien was a young man. So you have, anyway, the Catholic Christian influence there. And then you have Herbert with a Catholic background himself, but becomes a Zen Buddhist in his manhood. And so a very different look at the world. How would you say, religion, and I don't even mean formal religion, but the spiritual, you can even take it there, it might be presented in The Hobbit as compared to Dune? Does anything come to mind for yourself there, Adam?
Oh, definitely. The Hobbit treats belief and religion. It treats it as more fact in a sense. In fact, it's so objective that most of the characters don't even have formalized religious ritual as a result of it just being there, right? Like the dwarves don't even question that Durin was a real dwarf that existed at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
The elves don't even question if Valinor exists. They don't. These almost fantastical, mythic entities are just treated as just things that are obviously true. For many beings, some of the major events were within their own memories. Like they remember those events. Galadriel remembers the fall of Numenor. For her, that's not something she heard. That's something she felt. She dealt with. Right? She is an old, old entity. She is ancient by the time the Hobbit kicks around. And so, most of them they were around to see it firsthand. So religion takes a very different. It's not even questioned because it's bizarre. It would be strange to question. You see it yourself, and a bunch of people all see it, and your kids who were involved in there see it. Like it's a very different thing when it's happening within a generation for some of the entities here. Maybe some of the men might disagree. You got the men of the East, for example, and how Sauron's corrupted them. But for the most part, people treat it like it's just obvious. In fact, the first religions really are Sauronic in nature. This sort of separation between memory versus, what may be considered to be unmoored belief, which is completely the opposite in Dune, where belief is not connected to the past. It's very artificial. It's very constructed. in many ways deliberately so. It's not natural. It's not idiosyncratic. Well, a little bit of it is, but it's more deliberately fashioned by the Bene Gesserit. The Bene Gesserit specifically go out to make religions.
Oh, there's
And
almost
then,
a cynicism to it, isn't there?
yes, yeah, there's a lot more cynical towards religion. So, I mean, it's difficult to find a more polarized perspective. Ironically, both don't talk about the truth of religion because they don't need to. One specifically criticizing the religion as something false, the other is not even bothering to question it. So it's interesting that neither of the two books really deal with the elements of where religion's true. Although I would argue that even Dune, contrary to Herbert's intention, perhaps, I think the Bene Gesserit are actually more spiritual than he depicts them as. I mean, the way they treat the Kwisatz Haderach is very religious in my view. While yes, they're building Paul Atreides to be a messiah for the Fremen to an extent. They're also making him their messiah to a certain extent through the Kwisatz Haderach. You know, they have their own messiah that they actually believe in. You know, so yeah, they cynically use religion, sure, but that doesn't mean that they're immune to it. Like, I don't think the Bene Gesserit are as free as some people might suggest, based on my very limited understanding of the setting.
And also something else, before we get into a very interesting quote from Tolkien concerning, actually two quotes concerning Dune, on the spiritual aspect, you have you have a single cult or a single religion is not fair to say in the Hobbit, but it is there's a monism to whatever their whatever their spiritual system is. There are no competitors. It is the reality. And then you have something like Dune, which is in its inspiration kind of a garble of the jihad and the Mahdi and different allegorical things like you mentioned before, messiahs and different traditions there. And so I think there's something to see about both men's outlooks on things. You have your Christian here, and then more of a synchronistic Eastern look at things with Dune. I intuit that as well.
Exactly.
Are there more of a stylistic question? I'm trying to think here. Obviously, in The Hobbit, there are endless songs, or I shouldn't say endless, but there are many songs that Tolkien puts in there. Of course, Tolkien will also write his own language in the Silmarillion. Are there any songs in Dune or any of the sequels can you think of?
Again, I'm not familiar enough with the work to be able to answer that question.
Yes, I don't believe there are, and I think we have a difference there between British, especially British of Tolkien's generation, the British folk music, British singing in churches, especially in the Anglican tradition, compared to maybe not so much from Americans in the second half of the 20th century. So I'm always interested in in just different social changes and the influence of technology and so forth, and how these sorts of things filter in. So just like in The Hobbit, Tolkien's own experience in the Great War, his own experience of the British class structure being a thing, let's say, his own religious convictions and so forth, all of that real life stuff influenced The Hobbit. Likewise, Frank Herbert, an American, mid to late 20th century, and all of that atmosphere go into Dune. And we want to remember, whenever we're dealing with literature or any sort of art, a lot of the value, especially the historical value, we don't think, what the hell are you saying? With the Dune and the Hobbit of historical value? Well, yeah, because they're products of the time period they're written. And we have to see them in every piece of art, just like a core sample. I was watching a show, and the scientist up in the North Pole, they drill down so many yards, and they can take out ice from 1,000 years ago, apparently, and they can figure out things about the atmosphere. And the same is true with art. When we read something like The Hobbit, mid 20th century, and that's like drilling for a core sample. On the same with Dune, and the same with any pieces, and we can intuit things about the cultural atmosphere from that. And that's where these books have not just a recreational value or an entertainment value, but also, shall we say, an academic or historical value as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely. Both authors, like I said, they were men of their time, and their beliefs, their perspectives, dramatically shaped how they wrote and
Mm.
why they wrote what they wrote. So,
And they were not ignorant of each other, of their work.
mm-hmm.
At least of Herbert. I could not find any quotes of Herbert concerning Tolkien. And this reminds me, let's see, what did I name this episode here? Let's take a looky. It is 10 o'clock on the East Coast, so you'll give us a break, won't you, audience? Two different men, yes. There is a book that is, if you're interested in literary analyses, there's a book entitled The Same Man, and it's a dual, Dual, a dual biography of Eric Blair, whom we call George Orwell, and Evelyn Waugh. And these were two very, very different men, right? George Orwell, a socialist, an atheist, someone who had turned his back very deliberately on the British class structure, although he had gone to Eton in his youth, compared to Evelyn Waugh, which was, again, the opposite, very traditional Christian, very classist, and very hoity-toity. And that book was called The Same Man, and it was interesting because their appraisal of the 20th century, though they were very, very different in their politics and worldview, was actually quite similar. And I think there's we won't do it tonight, but there's a study, and perhaps certainly a good article that we must perhaps our talented audience will get on it, comparing, much more systematically Tolkien and contrasting Tolkien and Herbert, because I think there's much there. But Tolkien did know about Dune, and I just like to spit out a couple of quotes here and see how we take things from there. And I have it, if it's saved, at the very end here. There we go. There we go. I don't suppose people can read this too easily, but so there's some notes here, and so I'll just read the whole thing, and then we'll go from there. So Tolkien, unpublished from an unpublished letter to Sterling Lenier on the 29th of September, Michaelmas, 1965. And Tolkien writes, "My dear Mr. Lenier, I received your book Dune just before I went abroad for a short while, hence the delay in acknowledging it. I don't think I shall have time to read it until I get a holiday. And then another note, Tolkien's unpublished letter to John Bush from the 12th of March, 1966. So that would have been about 5 months later. Tolkien writes, "Thank you for sending me a copy of Dune. I received one last year from Lenier, and so already know something about the book. It is impossible for an author still writing to be fair to another author working along the same lines. At least I find it so. Uh-oh, here we go, Adam. In fact, Tolkien says, I dislike Dune with some intensity.
Hmm.
That's from a very, very stiff upper lip British man. So when such a man says he dislikes something with some intensity, gotta watch out there. Those are fighting
Yeah,
words.
yeah.
And in that unfortunate case, I believe Dune that's a substantive pronoun. It is much the best and fair. No, it's not. Excuse me. That it does not refer to Dune. The course of action refers. Okay. In fact, I dislike Dune with some intensity. And in that unfortunate case, it is much the best and fairest to another author to keep silent and refuse to comment. Would you like me to return the book? Uh-oh, as I already have one or to hand it on. And I think I'll kick it over to Adam, but some of the thought is, besides maybe a different flavor to Dune altogether being grittier than Tolkien's writing, and certainly less enchanted. Also, Tolkien did not seem to like allegory very much, and there's a fair amount of that in Dune.
Yeah, like I said, I think that the two men were in some sense cut from the same cloth, but on completely different sides of the cloth.
Mm, mm,
And so they their works almost directly critique each other in a very real sense. I mean, Tolkien's trying to re-enchant things, while Herbert's trying to disenchant things. They're
mm,
trying to do the exact opposite thing with their work, and yet they're almost. It's almost as if like they both acknowledge each other, but in a almost abstract sense. Like
mm,
Herbert is trying to critique the very thing that Tolkien's trying to preserve, and Tolkien's fundamentally critiquing the very thing that Herbert's trying to preserve in a certain sense. So,
mhm. To your initial point that they're almost inversions of the hero's journey, Bilbo Baggins compared to the other fella in Dune.
hmm hmm yeah, Paul Atreides. Yeah, I think that they
Oh,
have.
Paul, that's it. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I mean both have a death of a sort. You
Mm-hmm.
know, um, multiple deaths actually. Frodo gets stabbed by the ring wraiths. He gets paralyzed by Shelob. Um, or no, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry, I'm Bilbo. Bilbo gets stuck in Smeagol's cave. That's effectively a death right there. Um, Paul Atreides literally dies after taking the poison, with the spice agony.
Mm,
Yeah, they both have their own death sequences of the sort, but they have the exact opposite consequence.
mm,
Whereas Bilbo comes back from Gollum's cave with the Ring of Power, which is used to solve many of the challenges that he encounters. Paul loses his humanity to a large
mm.
extent. So, they have the exact opposite reward for going into the underworld.
What's interesting too that I'm impressed by is again kind of that larger atmosphere that both men are writing from. Tolkien is very much in his generation of authors. You have this early 20th century, mid 20th century literary revival in the English language with all sorts of speakers, especially working in. Yes, in the English language. Um, and in addition, to that religious focus, you also have in England and also in Ireland at the same time, um, and in ways altogether in a different direction in places like Germany, this whole idea of trying to canonize and encapsulate a culture in language. And you have that in Ireland, trying to capture the Gael-talked regions, the Gaelic-speaking regions before they die out. You have that with, trying to capture folk music and other folk memory. You have that here at the same time in the 1930s, with Roosevelt sending people out to just capture old people talking on phonographs and things before that memory is lost. You have Tolkien trying to capture the English countryside, and indeed it takes all other dimensions on continental Europe. And then, so very much something like The Hobbit, which is a fantastical piece, but is also trying to capture something of English culture. And then you have someone like Herbert, very postmodern. That's where I'm going with that. Tolkien is, in fact, is very modern. We might think, how could you say this traditional Christian guy, so traditional when they changed the Mass into English, he refused to say the responses. He continued to roar them out in Latin when, not Herbert, mind you, but Tolkien continued to say all the responses in Latin. But then you have someone like, Frank Herbert here, late 20th century, mid to late 20th century, very postmodern. So Tolkien is actually modern, though we might consider him very old-fashioned, because what makes him modern is that he's trying to encapsulate his culture in this very enchanted, spiritual, incarnated, in a sense, world. The spirituality is very incarnated. It's like the door in Bilbo Baggins' house. But there is an artificiality in that sort of a project. There's an artificiality in Yeats and Pierce and men like that in Ireland, trying to capture Gaelic culture in the English language. So start there, and so forth. I happen to be about knee deep in World War II right now in my own reading, and there's the same, actually, much more artificiality in what becomes National Socialism, trying to take all of this mythic German past and then put it into modern political theory and scientific theory. There is something very artificial about Tolkien, but there's something very capital M modern, whereas there's something very capital P postmodern about Herbert and that kind of cynicism about about canonizing culture and almost deconstructing certain aspects, hence the grittiness of Dune.
Actually, I would disagree a little bit.
Yes, please.
Because modern does not mean, so postmodern is a slightly different thing than what I think Herbert was trying to go for.
Uh-huh.
I think Herbert was still very much a modern, but he was a modernist looking forward, whereas Tolkien was a modernist looking back.
Okay.
I would see, based mostly off the movies and a little bit of the book that I've read, it seems more like Herbert is saying he's not trying to re-enchant, he's trying to move away from the enchantment, but he's still, at the core, a kind of rationalist, right? He's still pushing for, sort of this idea of this optimal system that you could try to build given your constraints. Whereas Tolkien is going in the other direction, trying to go back to traditions, trying to bring back the pre-modern consciousness. Herbert's reveling in the modern consciousness, right? I don't really think he's critiquing modernity per se. Not in the normal way. I mean, maybe as a right-wing modernist, you could say that he's critiquing it, but he's still fundamentally a modernist. He's not looking to the past as like some glory age we need to go back to. He's just he seems to me to be a person who's very still grounded in this sort of idea that there is sort of an objective truth, that there's sort of an objective reality. We may not be able to easily grasp it, but it's there.
Okay. Yeah. On that point, yes, I can see that they're both modernist in that regard. There is an objective reality. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas a postmodernist would be like, meaning is
Hmm.
purely subjective. There's no objective meaning.
Yes.
There's no like there's no great meta there's no great mythos that
Hmm.
governs the evolution of things. They deconstruct everything. Whereas I think Herbert's still relying on rationalism. He'll occasionally critique it a little bit, but
Mm.
I think he's still at the core a kind of rationalist based on the very limited bit that I'm seeing.
Good.
And
No,
again,
thank
I
you.
have to admit my ignorance.
No, I think that those are good good critiques to bring up and good counterpoints to that. That even with sandworms, yes, Herbert is still the world is a rational world. Yes, I understand. Good. So, any final points here, Adam? Hopefully, we've encouraged the audience to run off to their library and check these books out. They're not long books either. You can get through them in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Not really. Other than I would seriously, try reading them. I mean, I'm trying to read them myself. I'm trying to get through them. I am fascinated by such things. I don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, but I am working on it.
That's it. That's all. That's all we can ask for here. So there we go. That is our September 2025 installment of Naturism, Philosophy, and Life. Again, we have avoided, in a certain sense, talking about nudism head on for the past few months because it stands to it would stand the naturist community very good to kind of broaden things out. So that was our intention here, and what a jaunt and what an enjoyable jaunt it was to get into these two pieces, comparing them head to head. I was not expecting when Adam had brought them up in a off air conversation, not expecting Frank Herbert and Tolkien here to be to ever share the same episode together, but it was very rewarding, and I'm sure we'll revisit them in the future. In the meantime, the audience can check us out here. You can check out all of the work here at Apocatastasis, primarily in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, rebuilding culture. We, as of this very day, are starting the autumn semester. We have 12 students under sail, thanks be to God. And we're heading off into a great semester. And there's all sorts of things you can involve yourself with at the Institute, both in person, especially with our Litchfield County Naturist group, different hikes and swims and so forth. We just had a great swim and hike in New York State last week for Labor Day, and we have all sorts of newsletters and academic things. And Adam's available for well, you tell the people, Adam. What are you good for in terms of tutorials?
Like I said, my main expertise, contrary to literature, is mathematics.
We'll have to get you for a
Well,
literature class now.
yeah, while I have opinions on literature, I would never say that like I'm competent in that regard. When it comes to math, I think I know my stuff for the most part. So if you come at me with K through 12 class or level math questions, I can answer them. If you're looking for undergraduate mathematics in college, I can probably help you there too. I can even tutor some of the classes I've taken in graduate school. And I'm more than happy to help any parents or people who are wanting to better themselves in mathematics for the sake of others. Let me know if you're getting interested in tutoring math as a bachelor's in mathematics and you want to strengthen your skills there, or if you're a parent trying to homeschool. I can help you get a better math understanding, which in turn will help you better educate those you serve, whether they be your fellow, your students or your children.
Excellent. And with that being seen to, we'll catch everyone next month as we carry on. We'll see where the muses move us in this series, and in between, Adam and I do a weekly show looking at Euclid, a much briefer show looking at Euclid's Elements. So, to the audience, thank you for your patronage. Thank you for your attention and your reading interests. And Adam, especially, thank you for hanging out and chatting about Frank Herbert's Dune in contrast with J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit.